Let's turn to our first panel of the day, entitled Diplomacy and the New Digital Technology Landscape. There is no question that the digital dimension of diplomacy is commanding the attention of many of the leading scholars of our field. To speak to this theme, we are very pleased to introduce you to our first panel's featured speakers. Jovan Kurbalija of the DiploFoundation, who is transmitting to us today from Geneva. Following Jovan, we will hear from Corneliu Bjola, who joins us today from Oxford University in the UK. And our final speaker of this panel will be Minseon Ku, who is the newest addition to the Grade School faculty. Minseon joins us today from Chicago. For a detailed biography of our speakers, please see the link to the panelists' bios, which was emailed to everyone who RSVP'd for our conference. So let us now turn to our panelists, and to that end, I would like to now give the floor to Jovan. Jovan, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I would like to thank you and Jeff for organizing this important event and for giving me a chance to be participants in the event. As you can see, behind me is the UN building on the background, and I'm connecting from International Geneva. And in the next 12 to 15 minutes, I'll try to outline my experience in dealing with digital diplomacy, which dates back to the last century, 1992. And first, I would like to share the screen to see how does it work. I hope you can see my screen. Could you just confirm?
Yes, indeed, we can.
Okay. Let me then.
It says we can see your screen, but it says double-click to enter. There we go.
Is it fine now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. The first two elements that have been shaping my work in DiploFoundation on digital diplomacy is, as you can see the screen, the approach that anything that we discuss about digital diplomacy must be technologically understood. Since the first expert system for diplomacy in 1992, from websites in 2000, 2010, social media platforms, and now second wave of AI and the large language models. What does it mean practically? For example, currently we have close to 500 AI agents developed for the different aspects of diplomacy. And we go deep into the AI in order to understand what's going on before we do any research or teaching. The second characteristic is that we anchor diplomacy, current diplomacy, in the long wave of the history of diplomacy. And I just published last week the second edition of my book on history of diplomacy and technology, arguing that history of diplomacy and of technology is history of continuity and change. Continuity of the core function of diplomacy, to represent, to negotiate, to mediate, and changes which technology brought from writing, the telegraph, and the list is very long, but I will leave for you to explore it in more details. Now, over this more than 3 decades in dealing in diplomacy, one of the underlying issues is the definition. What is it? Is it cyber, tech, digital, online? And I can tell you that I spend long hours in discussing with people what is the correct definition. And at some point, let's say 15 years ago, I gave up. And my point is that you basically explain when you use digital, cyber, tech diplomacy, what it is about. And there are 3 segments of interplay between digital and AI in diplomacy. Impact on digital on an environment in diplomacy operates, sovereignty, power politics, new topics on diplomatic agenda, cybersecurity, data, AI, and new tools that diplomats use. In more detailed analysis, those are here are the 3 segments. Therefore, when somebody tells me, oh, I'm in tech diplomacy, I said, okay, but what it is about? Is it about impact on digital and AI or sovereignty, or on new topics, or just on new tools for communication, policy analysis, and other fields? And this will be my framework for discussing today. As you will see, I will be moving between digital and AI and trying to cover the both fields. By the way, this methodology has been tested with close to 10,000 students who attended Diplo courses, diplomats and students over the last few decades. Let's start with geopolitics, the first interplay between diplomacy and technology. The geopolitics has different aspects, but some of them are international exchange points, data centers, submarine cables, satellites, and other issues. They impact the space in which diplomacy operates. Let's say 40 years ago, places like Detroit and Chicago were the focus of industrial diplomacy. Now it is San Francisco and Silicon Valley. Therefore, geopolitics is changing as there is a rise of the importance of digital and AI technologies. Today we speak a lot about AI, but underlying technology is still very simple. It consists mainly on submarine cables, although you have many overland cables. Therefore, you are hearing me, you're seeing me now from Geneva, most likely via Frankfurt, most likely Amsterdam, London, New York, and then to Chicago. Obviously, it's happening simultaneously, but still, it is a physical infrastructure. And I always argue that there is no cyberspace. Whatever is happening online, ultimately at any point is anchored under some sovereignty. Here, Swiss, German, US, UK, and we can discuss that because there is a common point that there is cyberspace. Legally and politically, I don't think that there is cyberspace. There is also a new shift in geopolitics around big tech companies. We know market capitalization of Apple last year was higher than GDP of the entire continent of Africa. You cannot exactly compare it, but just to give you bearings of the growing power of these big companies, recently NVIDIA. We know how AI race is going, mainly between United States and China. And now I will outline few main elements of this race. Typically, you can hear about AI chip supply chain, graphical units, NVIDIA, ASML, TCMS. There are a lot of acronyms, but those who are producing the basically hardware for the artificial intelligence. Now here we have the big problem, looming problem, and I would like to put it on the students' radar. For a long time, we were told that the more NVIDIA cards you have, the better AI will have. Now, we are hitting the plateau of that. With more NVIDIA cards, you're just getting slightly better results on AI. Therefore, sheer power of AI doesn't work. Therefore, from quantity of data, from the power, we are moving to the quality of data. And this is the major shift and probably the major element which will constitute the burst of AI bubble with, I would say, enormous impact on the global geoeconomics beyond digital and beyond AI, given the high market capitalization of big companies. There are now movements toward the sovereignty, AI sovereignty, like Swiss AI initiative. More and more countries are trying to preserve their knowledge within their territories. There are discussions on the use of AI for peace and security. As you know, AI is weaponized, and there are discussions in the United Nations in so-called First Committee on cybersecurity aspects on both digital and artificial intelligence. There is one important point that I would like to draw your attention about. It is the shift towards open source AI. It has happened since 20th of January. As you know, it is a historical moment for various reasons, but one reason is completely undermined. It was the moment of the launch of new Chinese DeepSeek model, open source model. China started developing open source solution. Trump administration in the latest US policy moved to the open source. What is the reason for this? If you look at the history of the internet and digital technology, all turning points were built around open source. TCP/IP protocol under the internet, domain name systems, Unix servers, all key points. Therefore, now there is a competition, not anymore necessarily in more NVIDIA cards, but in the open source model, DeepSeek, even OpenAI, which by the way is not open at all, launched the open source model. There is Llama, Meta, and these things. And here there is a different level of openness from the data sources, weights, and other issues. Therefore, especially for students, I would like to put it on the radar as a new geostrategical issue. In geopolitical field, there is a competition for the new, especially for Africa, next billion users, new markets, young populations, and allies on the international scene. But I guess we can discuss in more details this restructuring. That would be geopolitics. From cables to data, AI, open source. Let's go, what are the new topics that diplomats negotiate? Because digital, like any previous technology, impacted their field. This is what I show to my students. Ultimately, their question is what they have to negotiate to find institutions and organizations that will answer the calls from their citizens, their population, and deliver with the sole core of the social contract, Hobbes' social contract, that state and diplomacy has to basically deliver to their citizens security, well-being, protection of economy. States cannot do it now. Therefore, we need to negotiate international agreements that could do these basics of any government to deliver on the social contract to their citizens. Now, how it is done? It's done in the UN on infrastructure, security, development, economy, human rights, legal, cultural issues, more than 50 issues. Negotiation on digital, I have been going since 1992. As a matter of fact, all current arrangement from ICANN on the domain name, cybersecurity, e-commerce, WTO moratorium, World Summit on Information Society were agreed in Minneapolis and United States in 1998. Therefore, nothing spectacular happened in between on the governance level. There were some developments, but still core infrastructure is set in 1998. Important part of negotiation is World Summit on Information Society process with the Global Digital Compact. And here is, just to add to confusion, how many parallel processes you have in the UN in negotiation on different aspects of AI and digital impact on diplomacy. There was a famous saying of one US general when they showed him PowerPoint about Afghanistan actions. He said, if I understand this PowerPoint, I would win the war in Afghanistan. More or less, as you can see, the confusion is huge. I will send you the link with explanation. If you're students, please move and try to understand what is happening at the UN when it comes to the topics. Now, when it comes to the AI as an issue, there is a shift from long-termism. You can recall 2 years ago, we were warned that AI will destroy us, will kill humanity. Now we move to more realistic discussion of immediate short-term risk on jobs, security, misinformation. Therefore, that's basically the main development on AI. And AI as a topic is focused on 4 layers. Hardware, we already discussed GPUs, NVIDIA, algorithms, data and knowledge, and uses of AI. The higher in the hierarchy governance is, the better it is. The miracle of the internet is that the internet never had regulation on hardware level, on level. It had only light touch on the top of the pyramid, with the risk that it created with misuse of the internet and other issues. Here are policy implications of AI, socioeconomic, safety and security, human rights, and I won't go deeper into that for the sake of the speed up of this presentation. The key battle currently is around bottom-up AI. Technologically, it's feasible, financially, it's affordable, and it can be done. What does it mean? That today's our discussion is our knowledge, our exchange, questions asked. Therefore, it should belong to us, not to big companies. Therefore, we at Diplo provide technical developments to show that every university, every group of people can create bottom-up AI. In our view, it is a critical battle for the future of humanity, as centralization of knowledge, and I'm referring not to data, to knowledge. Centralization of knowledge can lead towards basically some sort of slavery, knowledge slavery in the future. Countries are now trying to deal with these topics. They're creating strategies. Here is the survey, a few strategies. Swiss, Dutch, UK, and other strategies. They're trying to see how to deal with these issues on diplomatic agenda. And we come to the third element. Therefore, we started with geopolitics, move to topics, and we come to the tools. I always anchor discussion on the tools for diplomacy in the Article 3 of the Vienna Convention. That's the basics. What are the functions of diplomacy? Representation, protection of interests, negotiation, consular function, promotion, and public diplomacy and reporting. And then we see how we can use, to what extent, AI for representation, not a lot, on digital, protection of interest, negotiation, consular function, and other things. And you will see in PowerPoint, we have quite in-depth analysis with particular focus on diplomatic reporting. Diplomacy is a profession centered around reporting. Thousands of cables move all over the world from Geneva, New York, bilateral capitals. And that's where AI is going to do enormous impact in the coming years. And we'll come to that in a minute. One input on the tools is so-called Zoom effect or COVID effect, when we basically shifted from the in-situ meeting to blended and online meetings. And it created enormous new dynamics, with the pendulum moving back over the last 2 years, but now stabilizing with some sort of blended learning, including online meeting like this one. Reporting is the key field where AI is going to revolutionize diplomacy. By the way, the key element of diplomacy, text, is basically completely impacted by large language models. This is sort of bad news for the future of diplomacy as profession, if I can call it in inverted commas. There are many, many good news, as you will see in my concluding remarks. In reporting and Diplo, we are creating knowledge graphs. Knowledge graphs are visualization of common points, differences between countries, which you can distill from the many statements, and you will receive the link, for example, from UN General Assembly. You can listen to the speeches, but you don't know what are the common points between Germany and Thailand. On what point? Here, AI can distill the patterns of similarities. Here are some agents that we have at the Diplo: policy analysis, negotiation, reporting, communication. We experiment with a few metaverse tools, and we run the training for diplomats through AI apprenticeship. They develop AI agents as a part of learning about AI. The slogan is learning about AI by developing AI. Let me just get back to the initial slide. 3 impacts on digitalization and AI on diplomacy. Impact on geopolitics in which diplomacy operates, emergence of new topics on diplomatic agenda, and use of new tools. Good and bad news for diplomacy. Let me start with bad news, in inverted commas. AI is going to impact profoundly anything related to text. It's already happening. Drafting reports, those elements. I'm sure that all of us are familiar with ChatGPT and other tools. Good news, and extremely good news, is that it will help diplomats to return from so-called bureaucratic diplomacy, of focusing on writing reports back to the capital, to real diplomacy. Real diplomacy of engagement, representation, and negotiations. Looking at the interlocutor on the other side of the table, engaging and trying to solve the conflict through discussion and compromise as ultimately important tool of diplomacy. Therefore, all in all, digital and AI are going to make a positive impact in definitely medium term and long term on diplomacy. Short term, we can face a bit of difficult time because diplomacy will have to adjust, especially to the revolution around the text as a core of diplomacy, and the revolution which is triggered by development of AI and large language models. Therefore, a lot of good news. Over to David.
Jovan, thank you so very much for such a rich beginning for our conversation today. And you've laid out so many different parameters and so many important questions that I'm certain will guide us through the rest of this panel. So let us now turn to our second speaker, Corneliu Bjola, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, David. And thank you very much, Jovan, for the introduction to this topic. Let me also start have a few slides that I prepared for our discussion today. I'm going to start sharing them. And let me, it should work from here. And I hope you can see the screen. And we are,
Yes, we can.
Okay. So what I wanted to highlight in just a second. Okay, just I wanted to highlight at the moment it's to stay tuned to the topic of the workshop. It's how these technologies are changing what we see nowadays. And I wanted to comment a little bit about this relationship between a new branch of digital diplomacy, what we now call tech diplomacy, and the global order. Is a relationship, how to interpret this relationship and what to make of it. And I'm going to touch on several points here in the next 10-15 minutes. First of all, I'm going to comment on the idea that what we see through these kind of new technologies is that there is a transformation of power in the international system, and we have to pay attention to this. The transformation of power in the sense that technology is no longer a tool, it becomes an object of diplomacy itself. With the coming technology, with emerging technologies, that's one point. The second is we have to understand the features of tech diplomacy. I'm going to touch on two of them. One is about polycentrism, meaning that there are multiple centers of technological innovation, and they are in competition. But also a term that I borrowed from Geoff Weissman, polylateralism. And polylateralism refers to the fact that comparing with bilateralism or multilateralism in the past, we don't have only states. We have various stakeholders, and that makes the issue a little bit more complicated when we deal with diplomacy. Third point is what are the sources of friction that this kind of dual dimension of diplomacy creates? And I'm going to highlight three of them. Question of speed, the question of authority, and the issue of normative contestation. And I'm going to conclude what does it mean for the question that I highlighted at the beginning, global order. And I'm going to borrow from the English school and Hadley Bull, the three dimension, the international system, international society, world society. And I'm going to say that actually tech diplomacy moves around these three layers. And whether we're going to end up with a more cooperative or more techno-nationalism, it depends on how this emphasis or prioritization of these layers is going to be conducted. We don't know yet. So let me start with a few comments about the vocabulary. So we've seen a proliferation of different terms in the past years. So I published a special issue with Marcus Korpromst earlier this year in Global Policy. We tried to clarify terminology. So what is tech diplomacy comparing with digital, comparing with science? And the way in which we define it, we try to bring back or bring up the issue of power. There are different facets of power used, deployed in diplomacy. With science, we talk about knowledge through peer review. Do you remember the CERN in Switzerland, or the Antarctic Treaty, or even international space? Everything has to do with the way in which knowledge was deployed through epistemic communities. It has limitations, of course. It's very slow, but it's still a basis throughout the past 60, 70 years. We have digital diplomacy with the Web 2.0, social media revolution. We know that, no longer a surprise. Jovan has been very much involved in developing this, introducing this field as well. I'm going to focus here is not the knowledge, it's the information power. that comes with digital diplomacy, the capacity to reach and to narrate and to shape perceptions and views. It's a different type of power, very important one. Some countries neglected it at their own risk. Others, went ahead with it. Now we have tech diplomacy, which is more like an offspring of digital. It overlaps, but there is some distinct aspect of it. And what we discussed there, it is that tech covers the issue of innovation or innovation power, in the sense that this kind of new things happening affects everything. And it's a way in which these transformative technologies need to be discussed and negotiated. Technology becomes, in essence, the object of diplomacy. And in this case, the power has less to do with how you promote knowledge or promote, certain type of communication, but more about, the type of innovation, whether you are able to build capacity, whether you're able to mitigate potential risk. These are essential issues. So what are the two features which I wanted to highlight about tech diplomacy? First of all is polycentrism. International relations always discussed about, bipolarism, or multipolarism. Prefer the term polycentrism because it moves away a little bit, from, it covers different type of aspects. It puts the emphasis on innovation and regulation as the main focus. And we have different poles, let's say, right? You have United States, which is dominant in big tech, venture capital. I think one of the slides of Jovan already highlighted the amount of money that United States exceeding everyone, overwhelming anyone, technical standard setting. European Union is a different animal, right? It's a regulatory leader, GDPR, AI Act, and a few other things coming, the Digital Service Act. And they try to export these rules, the Brussels effect, that it works to a certain extent. China, different type of model, state innovation model, if you want to tie to this new term that President Xi mentioned, the new quality productive forces, in which technology, whether you talk about Y8, 5G infrastructure, or anything else that comes, is tied to economic development. But bear attention that there are some other under the radar configurations or coalitions that are developing. It's Japan, maybe quantum, South Korea, semiconductors, and Taiwan together, Singapore in many aspects, India. So these are new forms that we see nowadays, but also in places that African have a strategy. They're moving with some different countries on the continent, trying to develop capacity. South Africa, for instance, one of the last to develop a lot of, capacity in terms of data centers and so on. Digital Cooperation Organization, first organization established after 1945 to deal specifically with this kind of issues. So polycentry speaks about this, that we have multiple centers. Polylaterally speaks about the fact that we have multiple actors involved. Yes, governments are still, right, involved in this in various aspects. You have industry, corporation, no surprise here. How much, these companies, Apple, it was the example presented before, international organization, but let's remind, right? I mean, we have epistemic communities, the Quantum Alliance, for instance, that is being developed as a new, on the horizon, quantum technology in Europe. You have cities with the smart cities technology also involved in this discussion. So that's important because it makes the entire issue about implementation a bit more complicated. And what does it mean when you have this? I think it highlights certain types of friction that we have to pay attention when we talk about how this happens. First of all is the question of speed. We have a gap, a big gap, right? In terms of how technology moves, we know that, it's no surprise. People or states, governments still ignore it. The speed in the sense that, in terms of, just to give an example, when the European Act was adopted and then ratified in 2022, and then ratified in 2024, ChatGPT was born or became public in 2022. And then in 6 months, it achieved 100 million users. That's the type of difference in terms of how regulation trying to catch up with what is happening. So there is an issue of speed, of how what kind of institution, how to adapt to the speed, the acceleration, technological acceleration. The second question, it's about authority. There is a transfer of authority that we have to pay attention. Speaking about polylateralism, government still in the driving seat in many cases, but companies and big industries and private actors are taking a lead. Give short example, how Elon Musk using Starlink, right, interfere into matter that was reserved for states before, war and peace, right? It's using Starlink, and at some point he took the decision to cut off Starlink for a certain type of operation with no consulting with state governments on. That's the type of authority diffusion or transfer that we may see. That's one example, right? And there is also a contestation of norms because we have different competing norms, right? I mentioned the American one, which is more, technology, light regulation. Europe is a different one, tries to develop a model of technology that it's what it is called human-centric. China has, as I mentioned, different. And that contestation of values is not easy to negotiate. But we have to observe, we have to take notice, we have to understand it. What does it mean? It means that tech diplomacy, I find it useful to think about it both as a symptom of disorder, because of these features that I mentioned, the frictions, the fact that states are unable to a large extent to impose themselves alone. Yeah, I'm not trying to take away the capacity of states to do things, but they are not able to do the same thing alone. And at the same time, a tools of reorder, because here we have to think that when we think about states, the rule that defines this kind of are standards that are embedded in the technology. Part of what is discussed against tech diplomacy is how to set standards. You set the standard, whether it's GDPR or whatever other things that happens in the case of AI. You change trajectory, you change pathways to action. An example is an article that I published again, this beginning of this year on the TTC. I found it as an interesting format. The EU, the TTC was established between the United States and the European Union in 2000. I had a number of meetings, about 6 of them. We don't know the future now with the new administration, but the point there about TTC is that this is a more informal type of format. They discovered a new format of negotiating or discussing, and part of the work of the TTC was to establish a shared language, how to understand the risks of new technology, because on the side of the two sides of the Atlantic, interpretation of risk varies. So part of the working group was to establish shared definition of risk and how to adapt and how to create rules for that. What does it mean? And this is what I want to bring in the English school. The English school was very important in the Hadley Ball at that time, highlighting this kind of different type of layers by which, we see things moving in the international plane. So we have the international system. International system is more the realm of anarchy, of competition. It's more the realist type of paradigm. And we see that, right? AI, it's about harsh competition of semiconductors, about how to prevent other countries to get your chips, the US Chips Act, or what is happening nowadays. The same about, quantum, how to prevent, other countries. There is a lot of hard-nosed competition here, and is going to continue. A second layer that we have in English Bull and Hadley Bull is about the international society. It's not only about power and competition, it's about establishing some shared rules. Shared rules despite the competition, Bull was speaking about balance of power at that time, about diplomacy, about international law. What is interesting nowadays, you have this kind of new hybrid institutions, TTC, the Global Partnership for AI, or the OECD AI Principles, tries to say, despite our competition, how to keep things, Global Digital Compact that was convened by the UN last September, part of this. And then there is this aspirational aspect of the whole society, right, in which is not only about interest, but also some sort of emerging values that we need to reflect with these new technologies because they are important and they are game changers. Hence, the notions of human-centric that Europeans provide, or the rights preserving technologies, they're going to affect everything that we know about ourselves, about our society, and some of the consequences we already know, we see nowadays. So the point I'm making here is that with this branch of diplomacy, we don't know exactly which way we go. We emphasize if the emphasis is on international system, yes, we're going to end up with a very anarchical type of digital order in which everything is a zero-sum game and relative gains, they pursuing relative gains, and everything is seen in these terms. We see the diplomacy at the moment navigating through all of these layers. The emphasis varies, but it navigates through all. It's up to us, it's not deterministic, how to combine these layers, speaking about. So let me conclude with this, in a sense, here, right, in the sense of tech diplomacy, is not necessarily a replacement, but I think is becoming a transformation of the operating system because power is changing. The power now is about setting standards for how this technology and embedding these standards in the technology that we develop. And that is particularly important. Protocols, design choices, standards, these are the bricks of the digital order, not the traditional treaties that we had before. And that requires institutions, different type of formats, more agile to deal with those frictions that I mentioned before, normative principles, and keep in mind where we want to go and how to go. It's not easy, not necessarily because we have different centers, but also because we have multiple actors. And the state is not longer necessarily the big one. It's a configuration that makes the implementation sometimes even more difficult. My preference always, international society, all society, because it's a more cooperative, a more stable, a more peaceful one. Well, let me stop here and go back to you, David.
Corneliu, thank you so very much for this presentation. I've focusing on the words agency and power and layers, and you have really added a number of layers to the conversation that Jovan has begun, and thank you so very much for the way that you've framed all of this. Before we move on to our third speaker, I just want to say once again that we invite the audience to submit questions through the Q&A portal found at the bottom of your screen, and I will be very delighted to share your questions with our speakers upon the conclusion of our third presenter. And so now I'd like to turn our table over to Minseon Ku, who is going to bring our three panel presentations to its conclusion. Minseon.
Thank you, David. Let me start sharing my screen. Yes, so good morning and good afternoon and good evening to our audiences across the globe. So today I'll be presenting an article that was recently published in July in Media, War and Conflict Journal. It's basically titled The Digital Reproduction of the State, Public Diplomacy, Digital Entitativity, and Strategic Ontology. So the inspiration for this article came about actually during the height of the pandemic in late 2019 and throughout the year of 2020, as we were all, undergoing the pains of having to be locked down in our homes. I was doom scrolling, obviously, and as I was doom scrolling, I was obviously, paying attention to what governments were saying on social media. And one of the countries that actually stood out for me was China PRC and its foreign ministry spokesperson's Twitter / now known as X account that was very much involved in sort of presenting narratives about China in ways that I found intriguing and interesting. So over the years, I've been following since 2020 how this Twitter account has been presenting China to the Western consumers of social media platform, because as you all know, Twitter / X is banned in China. And so this was kind of obvious to me that it was directed against more of the Western leaning or oriented public. So the other interesting trend that I had been sort of observing over the years is the increase in the sophisticated use of the visuals as well as the textual narratives and captions. It no longer was just a pure description of Xi Jinping's summary activities, such as the one that you see on the top left-hand corner, where it was just purely descriptive about who Xi Jinping met for what occasion, in what sort of setting, to sort of really trying to brand China and Xi Jinping as this active, benign player in world politics. So I started thinking, sort of start thinking about digital diplomacy and how it's being employed by state actors specifically. So in the existing scholarship on digital diplomacy in both diplomatic studies and IR, there's a tendency to see the opportunities presented by digital diplomacy in the sense that it helps states to, brand themselves, generate positive images and impressions of them. But at the same time, they do also present risk of presenting a very fragmented and distorted identity of these states, purely because there are multiple diplomats from a single country making their presence known and visible in various social media platforms. So whatever they say as diplomats or official diplomatic representatives, what they say and what they do tend to be taken as the intention or the position of the state that they're representing, resulting in this confusing identity of the state. So I present a different angle or view of thinking about digital diplomacy as not just public diplomacy or national branding. I started thinking about it more as a fundamental source of producing and reproducing knowledge and ontology about the world through digital diplomacy and diplomatic practices. So here I sort of shift the focus a little bit to thinking about how digital diplomacy is becoming a source of authoritative narratives about a state in order to make this narratives become knowledge, and not just knowledge, but how lay people think and feel about international relations. So I built on this concept introduced by Adam Lerner and Ben O'Loughlin in their International Studies quarterly piece published in 2023 about strategic ontology, which basically refers to remodeling of the elements of the international system through policy narratives, debates, ultimately contributing to the theorization of the international system. So building on this concept of strategic ontology, I basically argue there are two parts to my argument. And the first part of it is that digital diplomacy can be understood as reproducing not just a policy narrative, but literally reproducing the state, especially for social media users and consumers, in the sense that when social media users are exposed to such official narratives about a state, they not only see that as a messaging tool, they see that as the existence of the state itself. We don't quite know whether that actually does happen ultimately, but what I'm arguing here is that states use public digital diplomacy to actually induce and facilitate people's seeing the existence of the state itself by presenting a unified official face of the state. So I draw on this psychological concept commonly used in psychology called entitativity, which basically refers to groupness of an entity or the groupiness of it, because the more an entity is seen as a group, as a whole, as a unified whole, people perceive its realness, increased realness of that entity. So in other words, the more groupiness an entity appears to a person, that person will perceive the entity as existing in reality. So I sort of use that as an idea to thinking about how states are strategically using digital diplomacy to facilitate and to create this idea of digital entitativity in the eyes of the social media users. In other words, state governments or in states that are interested in using digital diplomacy are trying to create this perceived unity, coherence, and cohesiveness of their state as a coherent whole with human traits such as intentions, emotions, persona, and personality. So it is a very psychological process that that states are somewhat tapping into. So the second part of my argument then would be what kind of digital contents would states be interested in using. And so here I draw on symmetry visuals as providing ample narratives as well as content for two reasons. Number one, when leaders represent their state as diplomat-in-chiefs on the world stage of diplomacy, we as consumers of media and consumers of social media, we are bound to just leap to the conclusion that what leaders say and do on the public stage of diplomacy tends to be the official or official foreign policy position of that state. In other words, leaders are basically presenting, or what I call presenting the state by acting as diplomats in chief. Now, secondly, summits are interesting in the sense that they're fundamentally media events, in the sense that there are a lot of not just textual information, but in addition to textual information, there are a lot of visual materials that states can draw on and sort of like weave into the fabric of narratives that they are trying to make. So I take the case of China here, partly because it was interesting not just observing how the social media posts were evolving in terms of their content and their style and the stylistic features of the social media posts. It is also kind of like well known that China's the international public opinion toward China really declined and towards in a negative direction following the Wolf Warrior diplomacy between 2019 and 2021. So I took this case of trying to look at how China sort of responded. Well, in my mind, they responded to the Wolf Warrior diplomacy and the backlash that came from it. But more specifically, I was very much interested in looking at Hua Chunying's account. Again, she's the spokesperson of Chinese Foreign Ministry as of October 2024. I believe she no longer is. When I recently checked her X account, I'm no longer on X, so I couldn't quite see what other posts that she had posted since then. But her post is really interesting because she focuses primarily on Xi Jinping's activities, both at home and abroad. There are a couple of other spokesperson accounts that belong to the Foreign Ministry of China, but they have been focused more on, for instance, one of them actually focuses on the premier's activities rather than looking at Xi Jinping. So I gathered that she is basically the official, not just official spokesperson of China, but she was basically the official spokesperson for Xi Jinping himself. So I, together with 4 of my research assistants, we collected all these social media posts related to Xi Jinping's summitry activities posted by this specific account in the period between 2019 and 2024. So to put it simply, this is the number of tweets or number of social media posts posted on Twitter platform amounted to 965 in total between 2019 and September of 2024. The first conclusion that we all can draw based on this table is that the number of social media posts increased during this period. But more importantly, there was an increased use of visuals, both still and moving, for both bilateral and multilateral summits that Xi Jinping participated in. So based on from these 965 social media posts that that we collected, I then analyzed all of them manually using the hermeneutic approach to content analysis. That basically means that I take an interpretive approach, just really thinking about what China was trying to do based on my interpretation. And I identified 4 stylistic and content features across these social media posts. So the first feature that I identified was obviously the increase in the use of visuals that may or may not be associated with the summit in question. So for instance, during Xi Jinping's meeting with President Joe Biden ahead of the APEC summit in 2023, there was this repetitive posting of Xi Jinping posing in front of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco in 1985, really showing that China was trying to really home in on this idea that Xi Jinping used to have this affinity towards the U.S. historically, and therefore really trying to present China as a friendly major power that when it comes to its relations with the U.S. Now, the second feature that I identified was that China was really trying to home in on this idea that it's trying to construct a sense of community with non-Western states. And interestingly, if you can see the social media post on the left here, is this weird, awkward-looking family photo of the BRICS leaders taken in 2022. But what really stood out for me was Hua Chunying basically just explicitly saying that this is a virtual group photo. So the leaders were never there physically present together, but nonetheless, it just felt to me that China had to make that extra effort in sort of creating this its digital self digitally along with other non-Western states. And obviously on the right here, we can see the better version of a family photo with other world leaders, which is to basically center Xi Jinping among these Central Asian country leaders. Now, the third feature that I identified was that China was really trying to highlight and accentuate its history and culture by using summits, right, as a pretext to highlight its rich history and culture. For instance, on the left here, you can see during Xi Jinping's meeting with Macron, French President Macron in 2023, it's very obvious that they were trying to target the French-speaking communities and the French domestic public by basically tweeting in French and really, trying to grab their attention by highlighting the Chinese traditional instrument, knowing very well that the French people are very much keen in culture and arts. On the right side, you can see how the Chinese government then tried to promote one of its cities, Xi'an. That was basically the venue for the first China Central Asian Summit in 2023. And Xi'an is important not just for Chinese history, but for the shared history with all these other Central Asian countries, precisely because of the Silk Road, the history of Silk Road, really trying to home in this idea that China used to have working cooperative relations with its neighboring countries, and really highlighting how now Xi'an looks in the modern times. And finally, for the fourth feature, I identified this feature of China trying to humanize itself, not just for the Western audiences, but really drawing on the foreign public themselves. For instance, here on the left, you can see how Xi Jinping taking this casual walk with French President Macron, no tie again, and this is very much reminiscence of how Xi Jinping had this no tie casual chat with President Obama back in 2013 in Sunnylands, California. I think many of us are familiar with that imagery of showing two leaders really talking heart to heart about various topics. And so with that, so my conclusion is that digital public diplomacy is a two-sided coin. Obviously, it can on the one hand be really explicit about a state's foreign policy position, but at the same time, it can be a subtle signaling of one's place in the world. In contrast to all the pictures that I've shown presented earlier, you can see how here in the case of the APEC summit, which It's obviously US-led, US-initiated, and US-established organization and summit. We can't quite see Xi Jinping's face in this specific photo, and I think that was for a deliberate reason, trying to show this sense of aloofness, even distancing from the existing international order institutions. The other interesting conclusion that I drew based on my mini study here is that China faced a steep learning curve when it comes to utilizing social media accounts, because it was apparent to me that they were really trying to learn how the Western users were using not just social media, but using visuals in order to grab people's and social media users' attention, which really goes to show that China was really trying hard to somewhat present itself that will resonate with the Western-leaning social media users. And of course, this is not just limited to China. Today, we see a lot of world leaders actually, using their personal accounts to not just promote, policies and policies and politics, but also really producing public narratives that sometimes can really confound, not scholars like ourselves, but it just delays social media users overall. And I think that really could generate further political effects, which I hope to study more in the distant future. And so with that, thank you.
Thank you so very much. Well, I just must say, what a remarkable panel. And I want to thank everybody for your incredibly rich and thought-provoking interventions. And at this point in time, I think we have to finish our panel. So I want to thank Jovan Kurbalija, Corneliu Bjola, and Minseon Ku for your wonderful, wonderful contributions in getting us started. I also want to call attention to the audience that we are now going to take a break. We're going to return at the top of the hour to our second panel of the day, Recovering Soft Power in Hard Power Times. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you all at the top of the hour.